Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, who both trained as scientists, considered themselves the world's #1 and #2 popular science and science fiction writers, with Clarke assuming top fiction honors and both ignoring Heinlein, the other of the so-called Big Three of 20th century science fiction. In the Foundation series, Asimov posits psychohistory, a quantitative science, the knowledge of which would abbreviate a future dark age. In I, Robot, his Laws of Robotics, fairy tale conceptions, afford solutions to all problems. Yet in classics like Nightfall, he recognized inevitable human weakness. Clarke, despite assuming the cosmic centrality of humanity in works like The Star and the 9 Billion Names of God, saw Utopia, as in The City and the Stars and Childhood's End, as doomed unless humanity changes utterly. That transformation culminates his most widely influential work, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert A. Heinlein are the so-called Big Three of mid-century science fiction. Although born in different countries, they had some striking similarities. Heinlein, a native Missourian, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. Discharged for tuberculosis, he later served as an engineer during World War II at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Heinlein's fiction often reflects admiration for a military meritocracy, the idea that automatically people understand who should lead them and they will follow them. Clarke, born in Minehead, England, was a government auditor who then worked on the pioneering radar employed in the Battle of Britain. After the war, he earned a first-class degree in mathematics and physics at King's College, London. After 1950, he was a full-time writer. Asimov, born in a Russian shtetl, was brought to Brooklyn, New York at 3. He interrupted his education at Columbia to work with Heinlein during the war in Philadelphia, but later earned a doctorate in biochemistry. He was associate professor at Boston University when he turned to full-time writing in 1958. All of the Big Three had voluminous as well as influential output. Heinlein's writing is discussed in an earlier lecture. He also invented the waterbed. Clarke, according to Asimov, was the best living science fiction writer and second best writer of scientific nonfiction. Clarke granted Asimov reciprocal honors. In 1945, Clarke invented and published the invention of the geosynchronous communication satellite, that very technology which makes it possible for us to be plugged into news events all over the world as they happened. Unfortunately, because he couldn't supply a working model, when he later applied for the patent, he was denied. Instead, he used this in a story called I Remember Babylon, in which the Chinese launch a geosynchronous communication satellite and beam down pornography all over the United States, so weakening our moral fiber that they are able to easily conquer us. It seems like we're taking care of the pornography on our own. Asimov, who tried to write every single day, didn't invent anything consequential, but became one of history's most prolific authors, writing well over 400 books and editing over 500 more. All three had notable writing skill, craftsmanlike discipline, and scientifically informed imagination. All were active, but ultimately put intellectual activity above the physical in their lives and works. Heinlein felt that each person has a never-ending responsibility to improve the world. But Asimov and Clarke sometimes saw the possibility of a settled Utopia. Asimov expressed his belief in Utopia in his very first book, I, Robot. iRobot is a composite novel. That is, it's composed of separately published stories that are woven together to produce what in fact is truly a novel. Each chapter is a puzzle based on the 3 laws of robotics. Here are the 3 laws. First, a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Third, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Now, this set of laws, when you think about it, is really a recipe for the fairy tale. I mean, if you want to raise a child and you say to a child, be good, you really have no content in that prescription. The child has to figure out what it means to be good. When it says a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm, someone has to understand what harm means. How can you have a robot surgeon if that robot surgeon defines cutting open the human being as injuring him? And yet, the understanding of this novel is that through the development of a positronic brain, we can create robots that will correctly and necessarily follow these 3 laws in this order. The very first story in iRobot is a story called Robbie, in which a robot which had been rejected by the family is accepted because it risks its life to save the child for which it is a mechanical nanny. The fact that a child is saved by this selfless robot shows us that humanity is in the central position here. We have the fairy tale world again. The illusion of central position is being maintained. That's the first of the stories in the book. Reason, another of the stories, shows us that in some sense we can even give up the need for religion. Here we have a story in which a robot is assembled by 2 robot technicians on a satellite, the purpose of which is to capture the rays of the sun and beam them down to a collector on the Earth, which can then distribute the power wherever we need it. The key problem is this, that atmospheric variations make it such that a beam coming down from above the atmosphere may tend to wander about a bit down below. And since this is a beam carrying enormous power, its wanderings can destroy whole neighborhoods, whole cities. The robot has been created to keep the aim of that beam constantly on the receiver down on the planet Earth. The robot who's been created to do this comes awake when Donovan and Powell, the technicians, finish assembling him, and he begins immediately to perform his function. Donovan and Powell are ready to leave, but they want to have some final checks of the robot, and so they talk with him. They ask him if he understands his mission. Oh, yes, he understands his mission. And why are they asking him this? Well, they're asking him this because he made them. They made him. Well, you clearly didn't make me. I'm superior to you. If I weren't, I wouldn't be doing this mission. You would. I was made by God. You're just here because God made you too. It turns out this argument for the existence of God and what God has made in his own image goes utterly unsolved. But because of the 3 laws of robotics, the fact that this robot won't see reason is in a sense immaterial. This robot cannot allow human beings to come to harm. He will perfectly carry out his mission, and Donovan and Powell decide that they'll just ignore the fact that the robot misunderstands religion, or so they think, and leave. The stories are held together by the narration of Dr. Susan Calvin, a robo-psychologist. someone who has true faith in these robots and who says that robots are essentially the same as human beings, except that robots are decent. As the stories go on and cover longer and longer periods of time, Susan Calvin ages. She tells us stories of the robots as they become more involved in our world, and eventually we have a situation in which the world itself has a single peaceful government. It looks to be as if these three laws of robotics have led to, finally, an utopia. The world governor, Stephen Byerly, is a somewhat enigmatic figure. Some people think he may even be a robot. In the last story, The Inevitable Conflict, Susan Calvin confronts Stephen Byerly. Stephen, how do we know what the ultimate good of humanity will entail? We haven't at our disposal the infinite factors that the machine has at its. Stephen answers as if he were a human being, and perhaps he is. Are you telling me, Susan, that the Society for Humanity, which wants to get robots off the Earth, that the Society for Humanity is right, and that mankind has lost its own say in its future? It never had any, really. It was always at the mercy of economic and sociological forces it did not understand, at the whims of climate and fortunes of war. Now the machines understand them, and no one can stop them, since the machines will deal with them as they are dealing with the society, having as they do the greatest of weapons at their disposal, the absolute control of our economy. How horrible, Susan says. Perhaps how wonderful, Stephen replies. Think that for all time, all conflicts are finally evitable. Only the machines from now on are inevitable. And here's the last line of the story, and hence of the book, told in Roman type. It says, "And the fire behind the quartz went out, and only a curl of smoke was left to indicate its place." Then the book switches into italics. "And that is all," said Dr. Calvin, rising. "I saw it from the beginning, when the poor robots couldn't speak, to the end, when they stand between mankind and destruction. I will see no more. My life is over. You will see what comes next," she says to the person taking these notes from her. I never saw Susan Calvin again. She died last month at the age of 82. When I first read this book, I was sure, because of the dominance of the three laws of robotics, that we had to be in a world that had a happy ending. In fact, as we go from story to story, from the robot as simple nanny to the robots controlling for our benefit the world's economy, it's clear, I thought, that we have gone to an utopia, a mechanically produced perfect society. But that last image in Roman type threw me. "And the fire behind the quartz went out, and only a curl of smoke was left to indicate its place." Fire, light, is a symbol for knowledge. Was this saying that protected somehow behind the quartz fireplace? Human knowledge was going, that we were always, in fact, going to be enslaved by the robots? It just didn't seem to me right. I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, an art historian, and she said, "I've seen that on the Marode altarpiece." In medieval Annunciation paintings, we see the light of divine inspiration coming down to announce to Mary that she will bear the Holy Child. In order to indicate how bright is that inspiration, how bright is that light from heaven, what medieval painters typically do is show the golden beams going across a table where Mary is reading, and that beam then either goes into her womb or into her mind. It crosses a candle, and the candle is shown to have a wisp of smoke coming up from it. because to the medieval painters, the only way to show a brilliance greater than that of gold was to show that compared to that light, the light of a candle was as if it had been extinguished. It turns out that Asimov has written his own books on art history. That last image is much more subtle than popular literature might lead us to believe. Asimov wrote many popular science fictions in extended series. The Robots series, which also contains novels like The Caves of Steel, which is a wonderful detective story that has two sidekicks, one human and one robot, goes on and later develops into an entire series of its own. The Foundation series won a Hugo Award as the best science fiction series of all time. This story, this trilogy, is motivated by a character named Harry Seldon, who has developed what he calls psychohistory. He is a mathematician who has figured out how to quantify the forces of civilization. He is able to see that indeed we are on our way to a new dark age. History is cyclical. And he is able to calculate that that new dark age will last 30,000 years. But he sets up two foundations, one that is known and one that is secret. And these foundations have their own instructions as to what they should do and how they should act in the known universe in order to bring about change, which in fact they succeed in doing, and make that dark age last only 1,000 years. Later in life, Asimov extended both of these series and another, weaving them all finally into a single, perfect, coherent, fictional future. In many ways, then, Asimov is a true believer in the perfectibility of human society. He's a trained scientist who tells us stories that show us that if we can make the right machines and trust them, we will have a perfect world. And yet, his story called Nightfall, which shows quite the opposite, is the single most reprinted science fiction story of all time. Nightfall is set on a world that has multiple suns around it. Because of the mechanics of the astronomy, and we can work out the hard SF if we like, it is never fully dark on the surface of this planet anywhere, save for once every 2,500 years. This planet develops myths about other lights in the sky, much smaller lights, but bright white rather than orange or red. Lights that one can only see when the sky itself goes dark. That myth, those myths underlie the religion of this planet, and the story is set at a time when they are approaching what the astronomers working on the truth of this myth have calculated must be the time when there would be a nightfall. Now, they know from the myths that the darkness, which is a lot like closing your eyes, that the darkness drives people crazy. So people have gone away into homes and houses and so on, hoping to be out of harm's way. What happens is that nightfall does come, and people are at first awestruck as not 1, 2, or 6 stars appear in the sky, but billions. And then the run of humanity is so frightened by this darkness that they begin to burn whatever they can in order to create fire and light, and they bring down civilization. And we come to understand that with this nightfall is the nightfall of civilization itself. Back to cyclic history. The only hope we have is that in one of these cycles, people will come to understand the realities of astronomy far enough in advance of the actual nightfall that they will be able to prepare psychologically for what nightfall will mean. Can we learn fast enough? It's a great story. And as I say, it's been reprinted more than any other. This is not utopian. It asks us to take charge and hopes we can succeed. Clarke's books, taken together, express more hope in an a-utopia, that is, a positive utopia, than they do in the humanity that might achieve it. Although all three of the big three had scientific training, Clarke was the acknowledged master of so-called hard SF. Hard SF is the science fiction in which the fan believes that he could, if he wanted to, check with calculations whether or not the science fiction author has really gotten his stuff right. Did that satellite go into orbit around that planet exactly that fast? In A Fall of Moondust, Clarke creates a tour de force of hard SF. In this novel, the moon is supposed to have seas composed of microscopic dust particles created by the eternity-long pounding of meteorites onto the surface of the moon. In order to support the research station on the moon, there is a tourist trade, and the tourists go about the moon's seas in what can only be described as a paddle wheel submarine. That is, it's a submarine in the sense that it is fully pressurized because, after all, the moon has no atmosphere. And it's paddle wheel because the way this vehicle works is to push itself along the surface of the seas. The action of the novel takes place because the particular tourist vehicle becomes disabled. And as they are sitting on the sea, they begin slowly to sink. As they sink, the captain increases the internal pressure to keep the vessel from being crushed. Of course, the stewardesses are going back and forth offering coffee, tea, and milk, as they typically used to do on airplanes back in the 1960s. And a British tourist takes some tea and says, "Why, this is the first decent cup of tea I've had since I got to the moon." The reader is expected to understand that water boils at a higher temperature the higher the pressure that it is at. That on the moon, the pressure has always been maintained at a fraction of Earth normal. That as the pressure goes up inside this vehicle, the water boils at a higher temperature, and hence the tea bags are able to transmit more of their aromatic chemicals to the water around them than could have been done before. If the tourist were as smart as Clarke assumes his fans are, he would have understood that the vessel was indeed in trouble. That's hard SF. At a deeper philosophical level, we see Clarke using hard SF, I think, magisterially in Rendezvous with Rama. This is a masterpiece. A something comes into our galaxy. It's a reminder of The Star by Wells. And as it comes closer to our solar system, we see it begin to grow. We see the light coming from it. Ultimately, it turns out that this is a kilometers long, kilometers wide cylinder that is going to go by our sun and use it for a gravitational assist to go on somewhere else. But it's clearly artificial. Human beings name it Rama. A group of spacemen are sent to intercept it, and they need to break into this machine. I can't begin to tell you all of the wonders that they encounter, but the most important thing is this. Inside Rama, we see developing an entire ecosystem automatically motivated by the increasing proximity to the sun that provides energy for this thing. We see, for example, inside this huge cylinder, Coriolis forces creating diametric along the central diameter, axial thunderstorms. We see the ways in which people can change gravity as they go from the outer surface down long sloping spiral staircases to someplace from the central axis down to the edges. We see self-organizing pools of protein begin to make creatures or machines that come out and walk around. And most importantly, at the end, the humans leave having made no impact whatsoever on Rama. Whoever made Rama didn't care about human beings and its technology can ignore us. This is atypical of Clarke, who typically is homocentric. But as an example of hard SF, where we can see human beings confronting every aspect of a fully mechanical but fully alien environment, it's a remarkable work, and philosophically, it puts us in our place. Clarke often wrote unquestioningly homocentric works, as in his version of The Star, where God wipes out a civilization so the wise men can be guided to Bethlehem, or the 9 billion names of God, in which the computer manages to fulfill an ancient Tibetan prophecy about how to bring about God's desired redemption of the world. In Childhood's End, perhaps Clarke's most persisting novel, that is the one that gets read and read and read the most, as opposed to 2001, which is perhaps most likely to be seen in Stanley Kubrick's movie version. In Childhood's End, we need to transcend ourselves. Aliens come down and force us to stop killing each other. A utopia evolves, but boredom sets in. Ultimately, however, it seems that these aliens want to see us because they know that we are able to make what they call total breakthrough. Everyone under the age of puberty at one time is going to change into something else. And at the end of this novel, all of the youth of the world make this change. The last image we see is of them joining together in a pillar of fire that hangs in space, reaches down to the earth, and in a sense consumes it and sucks itself back up. This now completely hive-minded humanity is off to join the overmind, if the overmind exists. Is that the destruction of humanity because, after all, without individuality, there is no humanity? Or is it the transcendence of humanity to join with God? You'll need to read the novel to make your decision about that. In The City and the Stars, we have a world in which everything has become a perfect city. It answers our prayers. We just say, I'd like some fruit, and the central computer materializes it in front of us. It's a complete fairy tale world, but the inhabitants are thoroughly agoraphobic. They are afraid to venture outside. Our hero is the first person in eons who wants to go outside, and he ultimately joins with the pastoral people who live outside, and they together rediscover the possibility of humanity exploring the universe. We need, in other words, to return to our childhood. That's where Utopia lies, if anywhere. Clarke's most famous work is 2001, A Space Odyssey. Kubrick's version of it in 1968 is a landmark in film history. Before this, science fiction films were primarily cheap xenophobic kinds of things with big tarantulas or huge ants reflecting our fear of atomic war or the communist menace. But with this film, we get true literary film. And it ushers in a whole new era when we find high production values in extraordinary playful science fiction films like Star Wars, or serious ones like Alien, or really philosophically radical ones like Blade Runner. These are the polished films to come. They begin with 2001. An alien monolith comes down and somehow, inexplicably, fosters discontinuous evolution in human beings. Ultimately, this happens a number of times. On the spaceship that's gone out to explore where the last of the known monoliths might be, further out in the solar system, the robot, the computer brain that's running this spaceship, starts to kill its human inhabitants. The one awake survivor, David Bowman, puts on a spacesuit and goes into a cabinet and begins removing circuit boards. But Dave, I'm committed to the mission, the computer says, when he pulls out the next to last of the boards he will remove. Hal, the computer, begins to babble nursery rhymes and then repeat things mechanically. The next storyboard comes out, the next circuit board comes out, and the machine goes quiet. Hal is not dead, Or to say it another way, Hal is dead, but the computer is not. Without the computer, 95% of which still exists, Dave could not continue his journey. What makes a human being is the ability to make choice, and science fiction continues to explore that. A machine is not a human being, but some machine, like Heinlein's Mike, or Hal, might be. Off in space, Dave goes through an extraordinary visual light show. In the novel, he goes through some kind of bizarre time trip, and the last image we see in both is of a huge fetus called Starchild in the novel, hanging in space inside a vast amnion above the Earth. And what would he do next? The novel asks. And the last line is, he would think of something. That's what science fiction always wants us to do.